My name is Ashley Thompson. I'm 32 years old, and for the last 7 years, I've been living a double life that no one in my husband's family ever suspected. This is the story of how I married into one of the wealthiest families in Connecticut. Let them treat me like I was nothing more than a pretty face with no brain, and watched them build an empire on my money without ever knowing it. I stayed silent through every condescending comment, every dismissive glance, every moment they made me feel small, because I knew something they didn't. I wasn't just married into their world, I owned a piece of it bigger than any of them could imagine. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from, because what I'm about to tell you will make you rethink everything you thought you knew about power and patience. If this story is already pulling you in, hit that subscribe button right now and drop a like, because you're going to want to see how this unfolds. The moment I walked into the Harrison family mansion for the first time, I could feel their eyes measuring me, calculating my worth like I was an acquisition they weren't sure about. They smiled with their mouths, but their eyes told a different story, one that said I didn't belong, that I was temporary, that I was lucky to even be there. My husband, Marcus Harrison, introduced me to his parents, Richard and Catherine, and his 2 brothers, James and Daniel, and I watched as they sized me up like a business deal they were about to close. I knew right then that this family operated on control, hierarchy, and the belief that money gave them the right to look down on everyone else. But here's what they didn't know. What Marcus didn't even know when he slipped that ring on my finger. I came from money, too. Old money that my grandfather built from nothing and passed down with one specific instruction. Never let people know what you have until you need them to know. So I played the role they expected, the sweet, simple girl who married up, who was grateful for the opportunity to be part of their world. I let them think I was weak, and in doing so, I became invisible, which turned out to be the most powerful position I could have asked for. They called me simple at family dinners, lucky when they thought I couldn't hear, and replaceable in conversations I wasn't supposed to overhear. Catherine Harrison, my mother-in-law, would introduce me to her friends as Marcus's wife, without ever using my name, as if my identity only mattered in relation to her son. I smiled through it all, served wine at their gatherings, and listened more than I spoke, because I quickly learned that people reveal their true nature when they believe you're not smart enough to understand what they're really saying. They mistook my quietness for simplicity, my patience for weakness, and my kindness for naivety. Every insult, every dismissive comment, every moment they treated me like I was beneath them, I filed it away, not out of anger, but out of clarity. Before I continue with what happened next, make sure you're subscribed to this channel and hit that like button, because the layers of this story go deeper than you can imagine. Power doesn't always announce itself with loud voices and aggressive moves. Sometimes it hides in plain sight, wearing a smile and serving dinner while everyone else talks over it. I chose to be invisible not because I had to, but because invisibility gave me access to everything. When you're not seen as a threat, people speak freely around you. They make plans, reveal insecurities, show their cards without even realizing they're playing poker. I watched the Harrison family operate their business empire from the inside, saw how decisions were made, understood where the cracks were forming, and learned exactly who held real power versus who just performed it for the cameras. My husband Marcus was a good man, genuinely kind in ways his family wasn't, but even he had been shaped by their world. He loved me, I knew that, but he also kept me separate from the business side of his life because that's what Harrisons did. They compartmentalized, kept wives decorative and distant from anything that really mattered. I didn't fight it because fighting would have meant revealing myself too early, and I wasn't ready for that. So I played my part perfectly, attending charity galas in designer dresses they paid for, smiling for family photos that hung in their mansion, and listening to them discuss million-dollar deals over Sunday brunch, while I poured coffee and passed pastries like I was part of the staff. Family dinners at the Harrison estate felt like quiet interrogations disguised as celebrations, where every question had a hidden agenda, and every compliment came with a barb attached to it. Catherine would ask me about my day with this sweet, concerned tone, then cut me off mid-sentence to talk about something more important, making it clear my life wasn't actually worth discussing. Richard, my father-in-law, would occasionally acknowledge my presence with a nod, the kind you'd give to a waiter who refilled your glass. Polite, but empty. The brothers, James and Daniel, were worse in some ways because they pretended to include me in conversations, then spoke over me, or rephrased my words as if I hadn't been clear enough. I learned to watch their patterns, their power plays, the way they used language to maintain hierarchy at a table where everyone supposedly loved each other. They tested my limits constantly, not with obvious cruelty, but with jokes wrapped in smiles that made me the punchline. Ashley probably doesn't understand the stock market, Daniel would say with a laugh, and everyone would chuckle like it was harmless fun, like I was supposed to laugh along at my own expense. Good thing Marcus takes care of the finances, right? James would add, winking at his brother while I sat there, fork in hand, smile on my face, rage carefully tucked behind my eyes. But I never reacted, never defended myself, never showed them that their words landed. Instead, I filed away every comment, every assumption, every moment they revealed exactly what they thought of me. I learned who they were by letting them talk freely, by giving them the space to be their worst selves without consequence. What they didn't realize was that their condescension was teaching me their language, their tactics, their vulnerabilities. Richard ran the family business like a king, but he was terrified of losing control. I could see it in the way he gripped his scotch glass when someone questioned his decisions. Catherine needed to be the matriarch more than she needed to be kind, which meant she'd sacrifice relationships to maintain her position. The brothers competed with each other constantly, James trying to prove he was the smart one, Daniel trying to prove he was the charming one, both desperate for their father's approval. Marcus, my husband, loved his family, but carried the weight of their expectations like a stone around his neck. I watched it all, silent and observant, and I understood them better than they understood themselves. To them, I was decoration, not a decision-maker, something beautiful to display at events, but never consult when anything important was being discussed. I remember the exact moment I realized how completely they'd boxed me into this role. It was at a business dinner where Richard was negotiating a deal with potential investors, and I was seated at the table because Marcus thought it would be nice for me to join. When I offered an observation about the market trend they were discussing, something I'd read in the Financial Times that morning, Richard smiled at me like I was a child who'd just said something adorable and wrong. "That's sweet, Ashley," he said, patting my hand. "But let's leave the business talk to the people who understand these things." The investors laughed politely. Marcus squeezed my knee under the table as if to say, "Nice try," and the conversation moved on without me. If you're feeling the frustration I felt in that moment, make sure you subscribe and leave a like, because what I did with that frustration is going to surprise you. They treated me like furniture in a mansion, useful for aesthetics, necessary for appearances, but ultimately replaceable and certainly not consulted when rearranging the important pieces. I was the wife who looked good in photos, who knew how to host a dinner party, who wore the right clothes and said the right things at charity events. Catherine actually told me once, after I'd organized a fundraiser that raised twice what they'd expected, "You're so good at the simple things, Ashley. It's really quite charming." The simple things. As if coordinating a 300-person event with silent auctions, celebrity guests, and corporate sponsors was equivalent to arranging flowers. But here's what made it all so darkly funny. They never asked what I did before marrying Marcus, never questioned where I came from, or what my background was. They knew my parents had passed away when I was young, that I'd been raised by my grandfather who died 2 years before I met Marcus, and they assumed that meant I came from nothing. They saw a girl who'd been alone, who'd met their son at a coffee shop in Boston, who seemed sweet and grateful and uncomplicated. They never dug deeper because why would they? I didn't fit their world, so I must have been lucky to enter it. The possibility that I had my own legacy, my own wealth, my own power, it never even crossed their minds. Silence was my mirror for their character, reflecting back everything they tried to hide behind wealth and social status. Every time I chose not to defend myself, not to correct their assumptions, not to reveal what I actually knew, I gave them more rope to show me exactly who they were without the performance. People reveal themselves completely when they think you can't hurt them, when they believe you're powerless and beneath them. I watched Richard make ruthless business decisions while preaching family values at Sunday dinner. I saw Catherine tear down other women behind their backs while playing the gracious socialite at charity events. I observed the brothers sabotage each other's projects while pretending to be a united front. Marcus was the exception, genuinely kind, but so desperate for his family's approval that he'd sometimes sacrifice his own judgment to keep the peace. I wasn't gathering revenge. That's not what this was about, at least not in the beginning. I was gathering truth, collecting data, understanding the ecosystem I'd married into so I could make informed decisions about my own life. My grandfather used to tell me, "Ashley, silence is the most underestimated form of power. Let people think they know you, and they'll never see you coming when it matters." He built his fortune in pharmaceutical patents, quiet investments that paid off over decades. Never flashy, never public, just strategic and patient. When he died, he left me everything with one instruction written in his will. Don't announce what you have. Invest wisely, live carefully, and remember that money is most powerful when people don't know you have it. So when I met Marcus, fell in love, and realized his family operated on the assumption that wealth equaled worth, I made a choice. I could tell them about my inheritance, about the investment portfolio I managed, about the anonymous stake I held in various companies, or I could stay quiet and see what kind of people they really were. I chose silence, and within 6 months of marriage, I had my answer. They were people who measured human value by financial statements and social connections, who would smile to your face while calculating your usefulness, who genuinely believed that their money made them better than everyone else. That knowledge was worth more than any respect they could have given me. They praised my father-in-law's genius at every family gathering, toasting to Richard Harrison's business acumen and vision like he was some kind of corporate prophet who could do no wrong. The Harrison Real Estate Development Corporation was his pride, a multi-million-dollar empire that built luxury condos, commercial properties, and mixed-use developments across New England. Every success was attributed to his leadership, his instincts, his ability to see opportunities others missed. What they didn't know, what not even Marcus knew, was that the biggest investor in HREDC signed emails as Anonymous Holdings LLC, and that investor had pulled Richard's company out of near bankruptcy 3 years ago, when a development project in Providence went catastrophically over budget. Before I tell you what happened when they found out, hit that subscribe button if you're enjoying this story, and drop a like if you think silence can be more powerful than words. I had watched their company struggle from the outside before Marcus and I got serious, saw the financial reports that were public record, understood that Richard had over-leveraged and was facing potential collapse. Through my investment manager, someone my grandfather had trusted for decades, I made an offer, a capital injection of $8 million in exchange for a 35% equity stake, with the stipulation that my identity remain completely confidential. Richard took the deal because he was desperate, because he needed the money to avoid defaulting on loans that would have destroyed his reputation. The papers were signed through lawyers, the money transferred through multiple corporate structures, and just like that, I became the largest single investor in the Harrison empire. I funded their growth while being served leftovers at family dinners, literally and figuratively. While Richard took credit for the company's turnaround, I sat at the far end of the table listening to him explain his strategic vision to guests who hung on his every word. While Catherine redecorated their mansion with profits from developments I'd funded, she'd make comments about my simple taste in clothing. While the brothers fought over who would eventually take over the company, I knew that any major decision required investor approval, and the anonymous investor who held controlling interest was pouring their coffee and being told to smile more in family photos. The irony was so thick I could taste it, bitter and sweet at the same time. They corrected my words in public like I was a student who hadn't studied, interrupting me mid-sentence to rephrase what I'd just said as if my version wasn't clear enough for the room to understand. I remember a dinner party where I was talking to one of Richard's business partners about urban development trends, something I'd researched extensively because I literally had millions invested in it, and Catherine cut in with, "What Ashley means to say is," and then repeated almost exactly what I'd said, just with more confidence and a condescending smile. The business partner nodded at her like she'd just clarified something profound, and I stood there holding my wine glass, invisible again. It happened so often I started counting. 7 times in one evening, 12 times at a family wedding, countless times at dinners where I'd learned to just stop talking altogether. They ignored my ideas in meetings I wasn't supposed to be part of, but overheard through open doors, then repeated those same ideas weeks later as if they'd thought of them independently. Marcus came home excited one day about his brother James's brilliant suggestion to pivot one of their developments to include affordable housing units for tax incentives, something I'd mentioned to Marcus over breakfast 2 weeks earlier. When I reminded him, he looked confused for a moment, then said, "Oh, well, James must have been thinking along the same lines." It wasn't malicious from Marcus, just the automatic assumption that good ideas came from Harrison's, not from me. I watched my suggestions get filtered through my husband, repackaged by his family, and presented as their own innovation, and I never said a word about it. Each moment of dismissal, each public correction, each time they talked over me or around me like I was a piece of background noise, it taught me that patience is a weapon most people don't know how to use. I wasn't collecting grudges. I was collecting evidence of character. I was learning that the Harrison family's power was performed, not earned. They needed people to believe in their superiority because deep down, they weren't sure of it themselves. Richard's aggressive corrections came from insecurity. Catherine's need to control every conversation stemmed from fear of irrelevance. The brothers' constant competition revealed that neither felt secure in their position, and the more they diminished me, the more clearly I saw the cracks in their foundation. They began deciding what was best for me about 18 months into my marriage. And it started so subtly, I almost didn't notice the pattern. Catherine suggested I'd be so much happier volunteering at the country club instead of working at the literacy nonprofit where I taught English twice a week. Richard mentioned over dinner that Harrison wives don't really work, in a tone that sounded like friendly advice but carried the weight of a command. When I continued teaching anyway, the comments got more direct. Marcus came home one evening and gently said his mother was concerned I was spreading myself too thin, and maybe I should focus on what really matters, which apparently was attending her charity committee meetings and planning the perfect dinner parties. If you've ever felt people trying to reshape who you are to fit their comfort, make sure you're subscribed because what comes next shows exactly what happens when that pressure breaks. They decided where we should live, insisting really, that Marcus and I move into the estate's guest house instead of our apartment in downtown Hartford. Family should be close, Richard said, and Marcus actually seemed excited about it, not seeing what I saw. That proximity meant surveillance, that living on their property meant never being free of their observation and control. They planned our vacations to align with family trips, commented on my hair when I changed the style, suggested what I should wear to events before I'd even chosen an outfit. It was control wrapped in concern, dominance disguised as family closeness. Where I should live, how I should behave, what I should do with my time, who I should be, every aspect of my life became subject to their input and approval. And the worst part was that it came with smiles, with, "We just want what's best for you," with the implication that I should be grateful for their guidance. Control always wears the costume of concern, wrapping itself in language that sounds like love but feels like a cage. I felt it tightening month by month, the expectation that I would simply dissolve into their family structure, give up whatever made me myself, and become the perfect Harrison wife they'd already decided I should be. Marcus didn't see it because he'd grown up in this environment where family involvement in every decision was normal. But I saw it clearly. They were trying to erase me. One night in late October, 3 years into my marriage, they sat me down in Richard's study like this was a business negotiation, and I was the deal being discussed. Marcus wasn't there. He'd been sent to check on a development project in Boston, which I later realized was intentional, a way to have this conversation without him present. Richard sat behind his massive mahogany desk. Catherine perched on the leather couch with her legs crossed, and the brothers stood near the doorway like enforcers making sure I couldn't leave easily. The energy in the room was different, heavier, and I knew before anyone spoke that something significant was about to happen. Richard cleared his throat and said, "Ashley, we need to talk about your role in this family and what's going to be best for everyone moving forward." What came next still makes my blood run cold when I think about it. They offered me money. $2 million, they said, as if that number should make my eyes light up with gratitude, to divorce Marcus quietly and move on with my life. Catherine explained it with this horrible fake kindness, saying they'd realized the marriage wasn't the right fit, that I'd be much happier finding someone from my own background, that they'd make sure I was well taken care of if I just signed some papers and disappeared from their son's life. Richard slid a folder across the desk containing divorce documents already prepared, separation agreements already drafted, a check already written with my name on it. They'd planned this entire thing, coordinated it, decided my future without consulting me or their own son, and they sat there expecting me to be grateful for the buyout. Money on the table, dignity off it. That's what this was. They thought everyone has a price. That $2 million would be enough to make me forget 3 years of marriage. Forget the man I actually loved despite his impossible family. Forget myself completely and just vanish because they'd decided I wasn't good enough for their bloodline. Daniel actually smiled when he said, "Come on, Ashley. This is more money than you've probably ever seen. You could start over, buy a nice place somewhere, live comfortably." The assumption dripping from his words, that I was poor, desperate, easily bought, would have been funny if it wasn't so insulting. I sat there looking at that check, at their expectant faces, at the absolute certainty in their eyes that I would take the deal, and something inside me shifted from patience to clarity. My chest felt tight, not from fear or sadness, but from the sudden, crystalline clarity that comes when you finally see a situation exactly as it is without any illusions left. This wasn't about whether I was good enough for Marcus or whether our marriage was working. It was about control, about a family so used to buying their way through problems that they genuinely believed human beings were just another transaction. I looked at Catherine, who'd spent 3 years making me feel small, and saw a woman terrified of losing influence over her son. I looked at Richard, who'd built his empire on my money without knowing it, and saw a man whose power was so fragile he needed to eliminate anyone who didn't worship it. I looked at the brothers, who'd treated me like I was simple and lucky, and saw 2 men who'd never had an original thought between them. Before I go further, make sure you hit that like button and subscribe, because what happened in the next 60 seconds changed everything. I realized in that moment that silence had done its job perfectly. It had given them enough rope to hang themselves with their own arrogance. They'd shown me exactly who they were, people who measured worth in dollars, who treated relationships like contracts, who believed money could solve any problem, including the problem of a daughter-in-law they'd never bothered to actually know. 3 years of small humiliations, condescending comments, and dismissive gestures had all led to this moment. And instead of feeling hurt or angry, I felt something closer to relief. They'd finally crossed the line so clearly that even Marcus, sweet and conflict-averse as he was, would have to see them for what they really were. I didn't raise my voice or let emotion crack through my expression. I simply stood up, smoothed my dress, and looked at each of them in turn before speaking. "I need to think about this," I said calmly, watching surprise flicker across their faces. They'd expected me to either break down crying or grab the check eagerly, but not this measured response. "Give me a week to consider your offer." Richard nodded like I was being reasonable. Catherine smiled like she'd already won, and the brothers relaxed their posture like the hard part was over. They had no idea that in asking for time, I wasn't considering their offer. I was choosing the perfect moment to destroy every assumption they'd ever made about me. And timing, I'd learned from 3 years of observation, was everything. I didn't raise my voice or change my tone over the next 7 days, and that restraint was intentional, strategic, the final lesson my grandfather had taught me about power. Truth hits harder when delivered calmly, when the person receiving it can't dismiss it as emotion or hysteria. I spent that week watching them relax, watching Catherine plan what she'd tell her friends about our amicable separation, watching Richard reorganize company leadership charts that conveniently left more room for his sons now that Marcus would be unattached and focused. They thought my silence meant acceptance, that my quiet consideration meant I was calculating how to spend their money, and their assumption made what came next so much sweeter. I chose timing over anger, precision over reaction, because I'd learned that the most devastating truths land best when no one sees them coming. I called a family meeting for Sunday dinner, exactly 1 week after their offer, and I watched them gather in the dining room with barely concealed satisfaction on their faces. Catherine had even opened an expensive bottle of wine, like we were celebrating something, and Richard sat at the head of the table with the confidence of a man who'd just closed a successful deal. The brothers were more relaxed than I'd seen them in months, joking with each other, and Marcus, my husband, who still had no idea what his family had done, looked confused but happy that I'd initiated a family gathering. They thought I was going to announce my acceptance of their buyout, probably imagined I'd make it easy for everyone by pretending it was my idea. The anticipation in that room was thick enough to cut, and I let it build, let them settle into their chairs and pour their wine and prepare for my surrender. I waited until everyone had been served, until the first course was on the table and all eyes were on me expectantly, before I pulled out a folder of my own and placed it gently on the polished mahogany table. "Before we eat," I said, my voice steady and clear, "I think there's something everyone should know about the Harrison Real Estate Development Corporation and who actually owns it." The room went still in that particular way that happens when people sense the ground shifting beneath them but don't yet understand how or why. Richard's hand froze halfway to his wine glass. Catherine's smile became fixed and artificial. The brothers exchanged confused glances, and Marcus looked at me with concern, reaching for my hand under the table. I squeezed his fingers gently. This wasn't about hurting him, it was about freeing both of us, and opened the folder to reveal the truth they'd never bothered to look for. I told them, slowly and clearly so there could be no misunderstanding, that Anonymous Holdings LLC, the mysterious investor who'd saved their company from bankruptcy 3 years ago, who held 35% equity stake and controlling interest in their empire, who'd funded every major development project since Providence, was me. The words landed like stones in still water, ripples of comprehension spreading across their faces at different speeds. Richard went pale, actually pale, the color draining from his face as he processed what I'd just said. Catherine's wine glass tilted in her hand, dark red liquid nearly spilling onto the white tablecloth. Daniel laughed, an uncomfortable sound that died quickly when he saw my expression. James just stared, his mouth slightly open, and Marcus looked between me and the documents I'd spread on the table with complete confusion written across his features. "That's impossible," Richard said, but his voice cracked on the second word because he was already looking at the documents, seeing his own signature on investment agreements, seeing the corporate structure laid out in black and white, seeing the truth he'd been too arrogant to imagine. I slid the papers across to him. Incorporation documents for Anonymous Holdings, transfer receipts showing $8 million moving from my trust to his company, quarterly reports sent to my investment manager, board meeting minutes that required my approval for major decisions. "My grandfather was Edward Chen," I said, watching recognition flicker in Richard's eyes because everyone in pharmaceutical investment knew that name. "And when he died, he left me everything, including the ability to save your company when you were 60 days from defaulting on your Providence loans." Faces drained faster than their wine glasses as the full weight of what I'd revealed settled over the table like fog. I owned more of their empire than Richard did, more than the brothers would inherit, more than Catherine had ever controlled through her husband. Every condescending comment about my simple mind, every joke about me not understanding business, every assumption that I was lucky to have married into their wealth, all of it was built on a foundation of ignorance so complete it would have been funny if it wasn't so damning. "So when you offered me $2 million to disappear," I continued, looking directly at Richard and Catherine, "you were essentially asking me to pay myself to leave my own investment. The math doesn't really work, does it?" The room shifted like gravity had changed direction, and suddenly everything they thought they knew about power and hierarchy was suspended in midair with nowhere to land. Richard tried to speak twice, his mouth opening and closing before he finally managed, "Why didn't you tell us?" As if my silence was the betrayal here, as if 3 years of their condescension hadn't answered that question perfectly. Catherine set down her wine glass with shaking hands, her careful composure cracking like fine china under pressure. The brothers looked at each other, then at their father, then at me, trying to recalculate every interaction we'd ever had through this new lens. Marcus was still holding my hand under the table, gripping it tighter now, and when I looked at him I saw confusion giving way to understanding, then understanding giving way to something that looked like relief. Respect arrived too late to be real, and I could see them trying to retrofit it onto their behavior, scrambling to rewrite the narrative in their minds. "Ashley, I had no idea you came from such an impressive background," Catherine said, her voice taking on a warmth that hadn't existed 7 days ago when she'd helped plan my exit from the family. If we'd known, things would have been so different. That sentence right there told me everything. Respect based on net worth isn't respect at all. It's just social calculation wearing a mask. James actually apologized for any misunderstandings, which was a coward's way of addressing 3 years of dismissive comments without taking actual responsibility for them. Daniel went quiet, his usual charm short-circuiting in the face of a woman he could no longer afford to underestimate. Richard just stared at the documents like they might rearrange themselves into a more comfortable truth. Power doesn't shout, it stands still, and I stood perfectly still in the chaos of their realization, watching decades of their carefully constructed superiority collapse under the weight of facts they couldn't dismiss or spin. Marcus finally spoke, his voice quiet but clear. "You knew about this?" he asked his parents, and the guilt that flashed across their faces answered before their words could. "We thought it was best for everyone," Richard tried to explain. But Marcus cut him off, the first time I'd ever seen him directly contradict his father. "You tried to pay my wife to divorce me without even telling me? What the hell is wrong with you?" The anger in his voice was new, directed at his family instead of swallowed to keep peace, and I realized this revelation hadn't just shifted my position in the family, it had freed him too. I didn't ask for apologies or approval because both would have been meaningless, offered out of fear and recalculation rather than genuine understanding or remorse. What I wanted, what I'd been quietly working toward without fully realizing it until that moment, was clarity. For myself, for Marcus, for everyone at that table about who we all really were. I told them I wasn't accepting their buyout, obviously, but I also wasn't going to pull my investment or use my controlling stake to hurt the company. "I never wanted revenge," I said, looking at each of them in turn. "I wanted truth. I wanted to see who you were when you thought I was powerless, and you showed me. That information is worth more than any apology you could offer now." I walked away from that dinner with my dignity intact, my marriage stronger for having survived his family's betrayal, and my position in the world finally visible instead of hidden. Marcus and I moved out of the estate that week, back to our apartment in Hartford, and established boundaries with his family that were long overdue. Richard still runs the company day to day, but now he runs it knowing exactly who holds the real power, and that knowledge has made him more cautious, more respectful, quieter in his assumptions. Catherine tries harder now, invites me to lunch, asks about my opinions, but there's a distance between us that can never be closed, because I know what she's capable of when she thinks someone is beneath her. The brothers are polite, carefully polite, like they're walking on ice that might crack if they say the wrong thing. Some victories don't need witnesses or celebrations or public vindication. They just need you to know, deep in your bones, that you stood firm when pressure tried to reshape you, that you maintained your truth when everyone around you was invested in a lie. I won not by destroying them, but by refusing to be destroyed, not by shouting my power, but by revealing it at exactly the right moment with exactly the right impact. Marcus tells me now that he's grateful, that seeing his family's true nature freed him from trying to earn approval that was never really available, that our marriage is stronger because it's ours now, not theirs. And me? I'm still quiet, still observant, still patient, but now everyone knows that silence was never weakness. It was strategy, and sometimes the strongest move is waiting until the perfect moment to show exactly who you've been all along. If this story touched you, if you've ever been underestimated or dismissed by people who should have known better, you're not alone. Drop a comment below sharing your experience, because sometimes knowing others understand makes all the difference. The lesson I learned through 3 years of being invisible isn't about revenge or proving people wrong. It's about the power of patience, of knowing yourself so completely that other people's opinions become background noise instead of definition. My grandfather used to say that people will always reveal themselves if you give them enough room and enough time, and he was right. Silence creates that room, patience provides that time, and truth eventually surfaces no matter how deeply it's buried. Watch the next video on this channel about power revealed too late and the cost of assumptions, because the stories we carry shape the people we become, and your story matters just as much as mine. Sometimes the strongest move is waiting, watching, gathering truth instead of reacting to provocation, because when you finally speak, when you finally reveal what you've known all along, the impact is undeniable. Subscribe if you haven't already, turn on notifications so you don't miss what's coming next. And remember, being underestimated isn't a weakness. If you know your own worth, it's just an advantage waiting to be used at exactly the right moment.